A king's death should be remembered with dignity, written in royal style, accompanied by portraits, hymns, a funeral procession, and a legacy. But not in this case. King Charles IX of France, crowned monarch of one of Europe's most powerful realms, died so horribly, so mentally destroyed, that history itself recoiled. His last moments were not preserved in careful royal records. They were removed not to defend his dignity, but because they were too disturbing to fit the image of monarchy. To understand why, we must begin not with Charles's death, but with the massacre he set in motion while alive. It was the summer of 1572. Charles was 22, a boy placed on a man's throne, surrounded by the poisonous intrigues of the French court. None proved more dangerous than his mother, Catherine de' Medici. France at that time was on the brink, its people divided between Catholic rulers and the increasingly vocal Protestants known as Huguenots. Then came St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24, 1572, a name forever linked with blood. In Paris, under the shadow of the Louvre Palace, the city still celebrated a royal wedding meant to unite Catholic and Protestant. But behind the walls, secret orders were given, orders that turned celebration into massacre. With Charles's seal, Huguenot leaders were chosen for assassination, their followers slaughtered without mercy. The killings spread like wildfire, destroying Paris and reaching the provinces. Witnesses described bodies stacked like logs along the Seine, the water itself turning red. Infants were pulled from their mothers' arms. Priests gave blessings to soldiers before they went to commit what today would be called genocide. Screams and iron rang through the narrow streets. By some estimates, over 10,000 Protestants were killed in less than a week. When Charles IX was told about the bloodshed, he laughed. Not with joy, but with the nervous laugh of panic. He had lost control. Soon the coughing began. It is easy to imagine Charles as a cruel tyrant, a Catholic king executing heretics. But the truth was more complicated. He was a pawn, controlled by factions, crushed by paranoia, and ruled by a mother whose political brilliance was matched only by her coldness. Charles did not order the killings from belief. He did it from fear. In the following days, his mind began to collapse. He could not sleep, not because of ghosts but because of silence. The sudden absence of cries, the stillness of a city turned grave. Again and again he asked ministers and servants. How many? Were they all dead? Did any survive? He was not seeking to finish the killings. He was afraid of revenge. He feared that even one surviving Huguenot might come for him at night. His chambers were fortified. Every meal was checked for poison. Letters were burned before reading. He spoke to no one without a dagger near at hand. This was not a king in command. This was a ruler imprisoned by fear. This was a king falling apart. And then came the blood. Not from his victims, but from his own throat. At first, it was only fits of coughing, unexplained fevers. But soon the coughs grew violent. Blood-stained handkerchiefs, crimson marks spread across royal sheets. The physicians were confused. They called it consumption, a polite phrase for what was becoming clear. The king was decaying from within. Whether it was tuberculosis or something darker, history cannot confirm with certainty. But one fact cannot be denied. His death began long before his heart stopped beating. It began the moment he gave the command that condemned thousands, the moment he became executioner of his own people. The reign of Charles IX did not end with death. It unraveled piece by piece. As his mind shattered, his lungs filled with blood, and the weight of history pressed on him like a suffocating cloak. He was still breathing, but his legacy was already gone. Long before his lungs drowned in blood, the mind of King Charles IX had already begun to sink. Historians often skip the years between the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and his death, as though they held nothing but sickness and fading away. But in truth, that space was filled with something darker than disease. It was filled with madness. Slow, creeping, intimate madness. The kind that does not arrive with thunder, but with whispers. The kind that consumes a man silently, in the hours when no one is near. In the months after the massacre, Charles ceased to sleep. records from the royal household state, he remained awake for days, pacing his chambers in a trance-like state. When he did sleep, it brought no rest. His screams echoed down the palace halls. Once, a servant burst into his room thinking assassins had entered, only to find the king thrashing in bed, eyes open, arms flailing, choking on spit, pleading with unseen figures to stop the knives. The knives, of course, were real but not in the chamber. They lived in his memory, in the alleys of Paris, in the throats of the dead. Charles began to hallucinate. He saw phantoms at royal banquets, heard crying in the fireplace. Attendants testified that the king spoke to people who were not there, sometimes whispering apologies, other times shouting orders at invisible foes. On one occasion, he tried to excommunicate his own reflection, screaming at a silver mirror until it shattered under his dagger's hilt. The physicians of the crown called his illness melancholia, the 16th century word for deep mental disturbance, a general diagnosis that explained little of what was happening. Today, modern psychology might describe it as post-traumatic stress disorder with psychosis. But Charles's torment was not private. It was political. France was not only witnessing a king decline, it was watching a monarch decay before its eyes. He began refusing counsel. He no longer trusted his advisors nor anyone, not even his mother, Catherine de' Medici, who once directed every part of his rule. To Charles, everyone hid schemes. The walls had ears. The corridors had eyes. The servants were spies. This was a king slowly falling apart. And then came the blood. Not from the victims, but rising from his own throat. At first, it appeared only as coughing fits and unexplained fevers. But soon the coughing grew violent. Blood-smeared handkerchiefs, crimson blotches spread across the royal bedding. The physicians were left in confusion. They named it consumption, a polite description for what was already becoming painfully clear. The king was rotting away from within, whether it was tuberculosis or something even darker. History cannot confirm with certainty. But one truth cannot be doubted. His death had begun long before his heart actually stopped beating. It began the very moment he gave the order that condemned thousands, the very instant he became a murderer of his own people. The reign of Charles IX did not finish simply in death. It broke apart piece after piece. As his mind cracked, his lungs filled with blood, and the weight of history pressed upon him like a suffocating shroud. He was still alive in body, but his legacy was already gone. Long before his lungs were drowning in blood, the mind of King Charles IX had already started to sink. Historians often skip quickly over the years between the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and Charles's death, as though they contained nothing except illness and fading away. But that space was filled with something darker than mere sickness. It was filled with madness, a slow, creeping, intimate madness, the kind that does not arrive with thunderclaps, but comes instead with whispers, the kind that eats away at a man in silence, during the hours when no one is watching. In the months after the massacre, Charles no longer slept. Contemporary reports from the royal household state that he would remain awake for days at a time, pacing endlessly across the floors of his chambers in a trance-like condition. When he did finally sleep, it was never restful. His screams could be heard far down the palace corridors. At least once, a servant rushed into his chamber, thinking assassins had entered, only to find the king twisting violently in his own bed. His eyes wide open, arms flailing, choking on spit, begging invisible figures to stop the knives. The knives, of course, were real, but not in that room. They lived in his memory, in the alleys of Paris, in the throats of the slaughtered dead. Charles began to hallucinate. He saw phantoms during court banquets, and he heard the sound of sobbing within the fireplace. Several attendants testified that the king would speak to people who were not actually there, sometimes whispering apologies, at other times shouting orders at invisible foes. On one recorded occasion, he attempted to excommunicate his own reflection, screaming at a polished silver mirror until it shattered beneath the strike of his dagger's hilt. The royal doctors labeled his sickness as melancholia, the 16th century word for deep mental disturbance, a general diagnosis that hardly touched the reality of what was happening. Today, modern psychology might describe it as post-traumatic stress disorder with severe psychotic features. But Charles's torment was not private. It was political. France was not merely watching a king decline. It was seeing a monarch rot away before its very eyes. He began rejecting counsel. He no longer trusted his advisors or anyone at all, not even his own mother, Catherine de' Medici, who had once controlled nearly every detail of his policies. To Charles, everyone seemed involved in plots. The walls carried ears. The corridors contained eyes. The servants became spies. Meals became suspicious. Bed linens were inspected for poison. He even stopped bathing. He spoke in broken phrases. His hair grew untamed. His fingernails turned dark with ink and with blood. He scratched his arms until they bled, muttering that he could not wash it away, whether it was the sweat of sickness or the figurative stain of massacre. Yet what disturbed the court most was not only paranoia. It was the way Charles became obsessed with death, and not with his own. He demanded to read detailed accounts of executions, asking for descriptions of how bodies twitched, how long heads remained conscious after decapitation, what a man's eyes looked like in the instant before death. He stared for hours at anatomical sketches, reportedly tracing the arteries of the throat with trembling fingers. He even composed poems about corpses. One of them, scribbled in frenzy and discovered marked with wine and blood, read, "Let them float down the river, their mouths left open. Their limbs remember nothing, but I still hear them scream." This was no longer a ruler in power. He was a monarch haunted by his past, slowly transforming his throne into a tomb. The inner circle around Charles began to collapse. Catherine de' Medici, who had once supervised every act of her son's reign, now held her distance. She had seen kings perish before, but never in this manner, never so raw, so infected, so exposed. According to whispers in the court, she arranged rooms in another wing of the palace simply to escape the stench. Not symbolic, but literal. Charles's illness worsened, and his body started betraying him. His coughs came in such violent fits that they were mistaken for vomiting. The sheets needed to be changed 3 times each night. The servants wore cloth over their faces. The worst nights came when Charles sat alone at his desk, scribbling notes onto parchment. Not royal edicts but confessions. Pages upon pages, some readable, others blurred with ink and spit, none kept in the archives. One servant swore she once held a page that repeated only one line. "I didn't mean for them to die," written again and again, hundreds of times. This was not the romantic Shakespearean image of madness. This was not Lear raging against the storm. This was the complete mental breakdown of a man unable to escape what he had done. And still, he was not permitted to die. Not yet. France still required a king, even one unraveling, even one bleeding into his own garments, even one who saw dead children staring back from mirrors. For while his body was collapsing and his mind was deteriorating, his crown and his title still remained in place. So they locked the doors, muffled the cries, drew the curtains differently, and pretended that the monarch was still living. By the beginning of 1574, King Charles IX of France no longer looked like a ruler, nor even like a man. The boy who had once marched proudly through the gardens of Fontainebleau in shining armor, surrounded by musicians and nobles, now shuffled down dark corridors, coughing strings of blood, barely able to keep himself standing. He had become a subject of whispers, a shadow drifting inside his own palace. The monarch did not rule anymore. He simply leaked life away, slowly, violently, and in full view of a court too afraid to admit the truth of what was unfolding. What had begun as stress, paranoia, and hallucination soon turned into something far more physical. His lungs, torn apart by months of savage coughing, began to hemorrhage. His once pale skin shifted to a sickly gray shade, mottled with bruises that appeared suddenly along his back and ribs. His fingers shook without control. His teeth loosened, then fell. The physicians of the crown, desperate to put a label on his condition, called it consumption. But Charles was not simply wasting away. He was rotting while still alive. By spring, his body released a strong necrotic odor that no fragrance could disguise. Linen sheets drenched with sweat and blood had to be burned every single day. Carpets were removed. Curtains were pulled wide to let the wind carry the smell of a decaying monarch out into the Parisian air. Maids and servants fainted. Some begged to be moved elsewhere. Those who stayed did so under silent pressure. Their wages were doubled as danger pay. The king was not fading in silence. His decline came with sound, and it was terrifying. Witnesses spoke of the wet, rattling wheeze of his breath echoing through the stone corridors, interrupted by deep, tearing coughs that sounded like cries. At night, the palace was filled with the noise of a man trying, and failing, to hold his own body together. Each cough, each tremor, each spasm felt to Charles like a punishment. The massacre never released him, not for a single hour. At times, he shouted the names of Huguenot victims into the darkness, names only he could hear. At other times, he pleaded with invisible enemies to finish it quickly. He knew death was near. The only question was how long it would take, and how much of him would remain. According to the records of Jean de la Fin, a physician in the royal household, Charles began experiencing auditory hallucinations so vivid that once he threw himself from his bed, believing a mob of Protestants was climbing through the window. In truth, it was only the breeze moving the tapestry. In his mind, it was vengeance given form. Servants patted the walls with cushions after he hurled a golden goblet against the stone in a fit of rage and confusion. He cut open his own palm, reportedly crying, "It's not enough. It's not enough." One court member, who never identified themselves in writing, claimed Charles once whispered to them in the dead of night, "It's inside me now. The blood. It never stops." But it was not just his mind that betrayed him. By March, Charles began to vomit blood. Not drops, pints. After nearly every meal, he vomited. He lost weight so quickly that his royal garments had to be pinned together simply to stay on his shoulders. His cheekbones stuck out like blades beneath skin thin as parchment. His voice sank to a hoarse whisper. His eyes, once icy blue and sharp with calculation, turned bloodshot and unfocused, as if already staring at something beyond the human world. He spent most of his last weeks confined to one bed, inside a darkened chamber heavy with curtains, reeking of decay and vinegar-soaked bandages. When sunlight entered, it seemed to burn him. He demanded it be shut out. The outside world, and life itself, had become unbearable. Then he began bleeding from his gums, from his nose, from his ears. His body was like a failing dam, leaking blood from every weak seam. The royal physicians, unable to stop it, tried desperate remedies, cupping, purging, draining more blood in a twisted attempt at restoring balance. Nothing worked. In truth, it only hastened the decline. Each time they touched him, he seemed to return less human, as if the body itself was withdrawing cell by cell from the shame it carried. Courtiers around him no longer spoke in full voices. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Commands were whispered. Servants walked on tiptoe. Even the nurses dared not weep when they left his bedchamber. Not because they felt no grief, but because they feared waking him from the tiny fragments of calm he still managed to find. Charles IX was not unconscious. He was fully aware, until the very end. His mind flickered in and out of clarity like a candle guttering in the wind. And when he did speak, it was often a single word: pardon. Yet there was no priest beside him, no absolution, for Charles was not preparing for a death. He was enduring a sentence. The walls of the Louvre absorbed everything. The smell, the sounds, the slow collapse of a monarch whose body had turned into a battlefield between guilt and decay. This was not mere illness. It was a reckoning. Some deaths shape a legacy, but others are so grotesque, so deeply inhuman, that even legacy refuses to keep them. The final hours of Charles IX belonged to the latter. No chronicler of the crown recorded the whole truth. Not because they had not seen it, but because what they saw could never be allowed to exist in writing. France required memory, not nightmare. King, not a corpse. A man, not a howling shell drowning in his own blood. The date was May 30th, 1574. Outside, the sun was rising over Paris. Inside, in the velvet-draped chamber of death, the boy king entered the final convulsions of a passing no one dared name aloud. Witnesses, the few permitted inside, described a scene that resembled battlefield triage rather than a royal vigil. The bed was soaked, not merely stained but drenched. The sheets had to be replaced every few hours, not for comfort but because they became heavy with blood, mucus, and sweat. And still Charles often refused to let them change it. Let it remain, he whispered. Let it show. He no longer resembled the monarch of France. His cheeks were hollow, his lips cracked and discolored, his body twitching without pause, as if something within tried to escape. Around his mouth was a constant smear of blood, both dried and fresh, layered like varnish. His eyes no longer focused on the living. They darted endlessly toward the corners, toward the door, toward the ceiling, as though awaiting a verdict. In those final hours, the sounds he uttered no longer resembled words. They came as strangled gasps, animal groans, sudden shrieks that pierced the suffocating air and sent servants fleeing in tears. According to one anonymous courtier, Charles spoke without voice and wept without tears. Yet he remained fully conscious. One physician, and only one, recorded privately in his diary that Charles IX bled from his eyes on the last night of his life. No official accounts confirm this, but the respected court doctor described rivulets of blood leaking down the king's face, as though he wept through broken vessels. It was a grotesque imitation of grief, performed not by his soul but by the body itself, a body finally confessing. At one point in the night, Charles tried to rise. He could not. His legs buckled beneath him, bones too fragile, muscles wasted away. He fell to the floor and begged them not to lift him. "Leave me with the rest," he murmured. "I am among them now." Whether he meant the slain Huguenots, the line of kings before him, or the shadows in his chamber, no one asked. No one dared. At the edge of the chamber, his mother stood silent. Catherine de' Medici, once the most powerful woman in France, now watched her son's death with a face carved from stone. No tears, no cries, no whispered prayers. She had seen death many times, even arranged it. But this was monstrous. A collapse not only of flesh, but of monarchy itself. This was no mere deathbed, it was a warning. At dawn, Charles began vomiting blood uncontrollably, so violently that the guards turned away, unable to endure it. He convulsed, his chest heaving with every spasm. The sound of blood striking stone floors mixed with the cries. Nurses rushed to clean, slipping on the wet ground. No one spoke. At 9 in the morning, the king's body entered what one physician described as catastrophic systemic collapse. His skin turned ashen. His fingers curled tightly, locked in contorted positions as if clawing at something unseen. His eyes rolled back, his jaw clenched, and then silence. But not death. He lingered. For 3 more hours, the king remained trapped in a state of suspended torment. His breath was barely a whisper, his pulse irregular. His lips moved faintly, as though still attempting to form words. Those who bent close claimed to catch fragments of a prayer. "Pardon us, Saint Mon Papal. Forgive, blood, my people." And then, at 12 minutes past noon, the bleeding ended. Because the heart had stopped. Because the man had finally run out of guilt to bleed. There was no final declaration. No tolling bells. No balcony announcement. Only a quiet order from Catherine. "Seal the chamber." What followed was erasure. No death mask was crafted. No public display of the body. No grand procession through the streets of Paris. His burial was hurried. His name scarcely spoken at court in the weeks that followed. The king had perished. But more than that, a spectacle had taken place. One too disturbing to be written into the royal chronicles. Chroniclers chose vagueness. They wrote of weakness, of wasting, of consumption. They wrote around the truth. They did not record the soaked linens of blood, the cries, the stench, the final whispers, because what overtook Charles IX was not simply the end of a king. It was the collapse of a narrative, of dignity, of the very idea that monarchs die nobly. He had reigned in blood, and in blood he drowned. And France, unwilling to face that truth, did what courts always do with intolerable horrors. They buried it. Not only the body but the memory. They did not forget his death. They erased it. The death of a king is usually accompanied by reverence. Not just for the man but for the myth. Funerals become theater. Corpses become relics. Historians become poets. But when Charles IX of France died, the world did not kneel. It did not mourn. Turned away. Because some deaths are not remembered, they are managed. In the days right after his death, Catherine de' Medici moved quickly. There was no space for grief. No moment for reflection. The horror that had unfolded behind locked doors could not be allowed to taint the monarchy. What had happened to Charles? The psychological collapse. The physical decay. The image of a king screaming for mercy while blood seeped from his eyes. It had to be erased. She ordered his chamber sealed. The sheets were burned. The mattress thrown away. The stained floor was scrubbed with vinegar and lime until the stone itself cracked apart. His corpse, already swollen and rigid, was wrapped without ceremony. No embalming, no portrait, no wax impression, no death mask, a custom nearly universal among the monarchs of Europe. Because this was not about sorrow. It was about control. Catherine gathered her propagandists, poets, scribes, painters, not to honor Charles, but to bury him symbolically, just as the priests were preparing to bury him physically. The official version of his death would be short, sterile, and, above all, clean. His Majesty passed peacefully, it declared, after a long and dignified illness. No mention of the blood. No mention of the cries. No mention of the king clawing at the stone floor, whispering names never recorded in court papers. The funeral itself was postponed, then reduced. What should have been a majestic procession through the streets of Paris became a closed-off ceremony, guarded heavily, attended only by chosen nobles and clergy. The people of France, especially those still murmuring about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, were not invited to mourn. They were invited to forget. And they did because Catherine made it so. She ordered Charles's portraits removed from the royal galleries. Court painters were quietly told to stop producing his likeness. His name, when spoken, was always followed by one word: unfortunate. Not tragic, not beloved, simply unfortunate. Within weeks, his brother Henry III was crowned. No period of mourning, no great national pause. The machinery of monarchy moved forward like a conveyor belt, swift, impersonal, merciless. And for Henry, the memory of Charles was not just irrelevant. It was a threat. Henry had a kingdom to hold together, wars to wage, nobles to calm. He could not allow the lingering specter of a mad, bleeding brother to hover over the throne. And so Charles's reign, already brief, was shortened further in memory. Official records became strangely vague about his decisions, his speeches, even his presence at court. Entire years of his rule were reduced to empty phrases like the king consulted or the crown decreed, as if the office itself had ruled, not the man. It was a disembodiment, not only of Charles's authority, but of his very existence. Even royal scribes, famous for documenting everything, from meals to dreams, left glaring blanks where entries should have been. His chamber records stopped 2 days before his death. An entire 48 hours erased, as though he had simply ceased to exist. And perhaps, in a way, he had. Catherine took one last step. She commanded that his private journals be burned. The writings that once revealed his guilt, his visions, his confessions, gone. Every single page destroyed. Some argued it was done to preserve his dignity. Others claimed it was to protect the crown from the crushing weight of his truth. The erasure was so thorough that, within a single generation, Charles IX had become little more than a footnote. Just a name between kings more remembered. The massacre that had defined him was repackaged as unrest. His mental collapse dismissed as simple illness. His horrific death rewritten as quiet repose. But silence is not innocence. An omission is not forgiveness. The concealment worked. It lasted for centuries. Even today, most history books grant no more than a paragraph to his final days. Yet in that silence, something remains. a sense of wrongness, a gap where catastrophe should be, a deliberate forgetting, orchestrated by a court too ashamed to face what it had seen. Charles IX did not simply die. He was erased,